Okay, so we're saying here that with the simulation, she used the central 90% of this to check to see if the number of key attempts Emma took 4 was likely and the trial and error process was used. So she's telling us she's going to use the central 90% to see if it's likely that the trial and process was used, and they want us to confirm this. So if you want to think about that simulation idea, she's saying I'm going to take that 90% in the middle and see if it includes 4. So that means I've got 5% at the top I'm going to cut off, and 5% at the bottom I'm going to cut off. So we need to go back to our group here, and we know that out of 1,000, if I find 10% of that, so 1,000 times 0.1, I'm going to get 100. And if I divide that by 2, that's going to be 50, so I need to take 50 off the top and 50 off the bottom. So 50, looking for 50 off the bottom, 38, and that's going to be somewhere in the 10. That's going to be a 5% mark. And 29 and somewhere in the 3 is going to be another 5% mark. So if I cut that off, this part in here is the central 90%. And we can see that 4 is within the central 90%. So we're cutting it off, and 4 is within the central 90%. So we can actually say here that, yes, 4 attempts is within the central 90% of this simulation. So it's likely that Emma did use trial and error to find the right keys. And we can say a few things in here as well, that making this assumption here about the central 90%, we might want to justify why that assumption is okay, and we can kind of say it's okay to use central 90% because the distribution of attempts in the simulation is relatively normal, and it is unimodal, so it's okay to use the central 90. And the reason for that is that if it, we're just trying to figure out how do we justify what is considered likely to happen. So we might say, okay, what's the probability 90% of the time what happens? That's going to be the likelihood. But we don't want to take the ones on the outside because they barely ever happen. So we're looking, let's take the ones out of the middle. As an example where this wouldn't work, if we had a distribution who looked maybe something like this, the central 90% doesn't include the areas where it actually happens with the greatest frequency. So here, when we've got that peak in the middle of the central 90%, it's okay to use the central 90% to justify where it would be more likely to occur.